The Mississippi River had never looked more treacherous than it did on that humid morning of May 18, 1863. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison of the Union 23rd Iowa Infantry squinted through his field glasses at the imposing bluffs of Vicksburg, Mississippi, rising like ancient battlements from the muddy waters below. The city perched 100 feet above the river, its cannons glinting ominously in the early morning sun, had earned its nickname as the Gibraltar of the Confederacy. Through 2 years of successful resistance against Union naval forces, Harrison lowered his glasses and wiped the sweat from his brow. Behind him, the massive army of the Tennessee stretched across the Louisiana countryside like a blue serpent, preparing to strike. General Ulysses Simpson Grant had been planning this moment for months, knowing that capturing Vicksburg would split the Confederacy in two and give the Union complete control of the Mississippi River. The stakes could not be higher. The Confederate defenders, under the command of Lieutenant General John Clifford Pemberton, had transformed Vicksburg into a fortress. Artillery pieces crowned every hill, while rifle pits and earthworks snaked around the city's perimeter like scars on the landscape. Pemberton, a Pennsylvania-born officer who had chosen to fight for the South, understood that losing Vicksburg would mean losing the war. His 29,000 men were determined to hold their ground at any cost. Grant's strategy had been audacious from the beginning. Rather than attacking Vicksburg directly from the north, where previous attempts had failed miserably, he had marched his army down the western bank of the Mississippi, crossed the river south of the city, and was now approaching from the east. Through the heart of Mississippi, it was a maneuver that defied conventional military wisdom, cutting his supply lines and placing his 45,000 men deep in enemy territory. The sound of distant artillery reminded Harrison of the battles they had already fought to reach this point. At Port Gibson on May 1st, Champion Hill on May 16th, and Big Black River Bridge on May 17th, Grant's forces had systematically dismantled Confederate resistance, driving Pemberton's army back into the defensive works surrounding Vicksburg. Each victory had brought them closer to this moment of truth. As Harrison watched, signal flags began waving from the various divisional headquarters scattered across the Union lines. The assault on Vicksburg's outer defenses was about to begin. He could see the men of General William Tecumseh Sherman's 15th Corps positioning themselves on the northern approaches, while General James Byrd's I. McPherson's 17th Corps prepared to attack from the east. General John Alexander McClernand's 13th Corps would strike from the southeast, completing the circle of steel that Grant had thrown around the Confederate stronghold. The morning air filled with the sound of drums and bugles as the Union forces prepared for battle. Harrison knew that what happened in the next few hours would determine not just the fate of Vicksburg, but potentially the outcome of the entire Civil War. President Abraham Lincoln had made it clear that controlling the Mississippi River was essential to Union victory, famously declaring that the war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket. Inside Vicksburg's defensive lines, Confederate soldiers checked their weapons and said their prayers. They knew they were outnumbered, but they also knew they were fighting for their homes, their families, and their way of life. The stage was set for one of the most significant sieges in American military history. The first Union assault began at 10 o'clock in the morning on May 19, 1863, with a thunderous artillery barrage that shook the very foundations of Vicksburg. Harrison pressed himself against the earthwork as Confederate shells screamed overhead, their deadly fragments whizzing through the air like angry hornets. The ground beneath his feet trembled with each explosion, and the acrid smell of gunpowder filled his nostrils. General Sherman's men advanced first, their blue uniforms stark against the red Mississippi clay as they charged up the steep slopes toward the Confederate fortifications. The stockade Reedon, a formidable earthwork bristling with cannon and rifle barrels, became the focal point of their attack. Confederate defenders, many of them teenagers from Mississippi and Alabama regiments, poured devastating fire into the advancing Union ranks. Private William Thompson of the 115th Illinois Infantry found himself crawling through a maze of fallen logs and brush, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands. The Confederate work seemed impossibly strong, with their zigzag trenches and interlocking fields of fire, designed to channel attackers into killing zones. Above him, the stars and bars of the Confederacy fluttered defiantly from the ramparts, as if mocking the Union's attempts to dislodge the defenders. According to historical accounts documented in the Vicksburg campaign by the National Park Service, the Confederate defensive system represented some of the most sophisticated military engineering of the 19th century, the earthworks had been designed by skilled military engineers who understood how to maximize the natural advantages of Vicksburg's terrain. Meanwhile, General McPherson's 17th Corps launched their own assault against the 3rd Louisiana Region, a massive earthwork that commanded the Jackson Road approach to the city. Colonel Giles Alexander Smith's brigade led the charge, their battle flags streaming in the wind as they advanced across open ground. Swept by Confederate artillery, the sound of many balls filled the air with their distinctive whine, and men fell with sickening regularity as they pushed forward against the withering fire. Captain Robert Anderson of the 8th Missouri Infantry watched in horror as his company was decimated by Confederate sharpshooters positioned in rifle pits along the defensive line. The men who had marched so confidently that morning now lay scattered across the battlefield, their blood staining the Mississippi soil red. Those who survived the initial onslaught found themselves pinned down in whatever cover they could find. Unable to advance or retreat, the assault on the railroad redoubt proved equally costly for McClernand's 13th Corps. General Peter Joseph Osterhaus's division threw themselves against the Confederate works with desperate courage, but the defenders were ready for them. Lieutenant Colonel William Wade of the 1st Mississippi Light Artillery had positioned his guns to enfilade any assault, and his canister shots tore through the Union ranks like a scythe through wheat. By afternoon, it became clear that the first assault had failed. Grant's forces had suffered over 900 casualties, while inflicting minimal damage on the Confederate defenses. The bodies of Union soldiers lay scattered across the approaches to Vicksburg like broken dolls, their sacrifice serving only to demonstrate the futility of direct assault against such well-prepared positions. General Pemberton stood atop the courthouse in Vicksburg, surveying the battlefield through his telescope. His men had fought magnificently, proving that Southern valor could still triumph against overwhelming odds. But he also knew that this was only the beginning. Grant would not give up easily, and the Union Army possessed resources that the Confederacy could only dream of. The question was not whether another attack would come, but when. As darkness fell over the battlefield, both sides began the grim task of recovering their wounded and dead. The cries of injured men echoed across the night air, a haunting reminder of the price of war. Harrison helped carry wounded comrades to the field hospitals, where overworked surgeons labored by lamplight to save what lives they could. Grant himself rode among his troops that evening, his face grim but determined. The failure of the first assault had taught him a valuable lesson about the strength of Vicksburg's defenses. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new strategies, but he remained confident that Union persistence would ultimately prevail. 3 days later, on May 22, 1863, the thunder of artillery again rolled across the Mississippi landscape as Grant ordered a second massive assault on Vicksburg's defenses. This time, the Union commander had coordinated his attack more carefully, planning simultaneous strikes along multiple points of the Confederate line. To prevent Pemberton from shifting his defenders to meet each threat, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison found himself positioned with the 2nd Brigade of Sherman's division, facing the same stockade region that had claimed so many Union lives just days before. The intervening time had been spent in feverish preparation, with engineers cutting approaches through the tangled underbrush and artillery crews positioning their guns for maximum effect against the Confederate earthworks. The signal for attack came at 10 o'clock sharp, when Union batteries opened with a concentrated barrage designed to suppress Confederate fire and create breaches in their defensive works. For 2 hours, over 200 Union cannons pounded the Confederate lines, their shells raising clouds of dust and debris that obscured the battlefield in a brown haze. The sound was deafening, a continuous roar that seemed to shake the very earth. When the artillery barrage lifted, 3 blue waves of infantry surged forward across the broken ground. Harrison led his men up the steep slope toward the stockade region, their bayonets glinting in the afternoon sun. The Confederate defenders, many of whom had taken shelter in bomb-proofs during the artillery preparation, quickly returned to their positions and opened fire with devastating effect. General McClernand's 13th Corps achieved the day's only success, with elements of the 22nd Iowa Infantry actually reaching the parapet of the railroad redoubt under the leadership of Sergeant Joseph Griffith. For a brief moment, it appeared that the Union might have achieved its breakthrough. Griffith and his men planted their regimental colors on the Confederate earthwork, and McClernand immediately sent word to Grant, claiming that he needed reinforcements to exploit his success. The message that reached Grant's headquarters was optimistic. perhaps overly so. McClernand reported that his men had gained a foothold in the Confederate works and were in desperate need of support to complete their breakthrough. Grant, eager for any sign of progress after the morning's costly failures elsewhere along the line, ordered additional troops forward to support what he believed was a genuine opportunity. However, the reality at the railroad redoubt was far different. From McClernand's reports, Sergeant Griffith and his small band of Iowans found themselves isolated on the Confederate parapet, surrounded by determined Southern defenders who quickly organized a counterattack. Colonel Francis Marion Cockrell's 1st Missouri Confederate Brigade, fighting for their adopted state despite their Missouri origins, led the charge that drove the Union soldiers back from the earthwork. Private James Murphy of the 22nd Iowa later described the hellish experience of being trapped on the Confederate parapet. The rebels came at us from three sides, shooting and screaming like demons. We tried to hold our ground, but there were too many of them and a few of us. When the order came to fall back, those of us who could still move scrambled down that hill faster than we had climbed up. The second assault proved even more costly than the first, with Union casualties exceeding 3,000 men. Grant's forces had again demonstrated their courage and determination, but they had also learned a harsh lesson about the strength of prepared defensive positions. The Confederate earthworks had been designed by military engineers who understood the killing power of 19th century weapons, and no amount of individual heroism could overcome such systematic preparation. As evening fell over the battlefield, Grant made a decision that would define the remainder of the Vicksburg campaign. Rather than continue these costly frontal assaults, he would settle in for a siege. The Union Army possessed advantages in numbers, supplies, and naval support that would eventually tell, but only if Grant was patient enough to use them effectively. The transformation from active campaigning to siege warfare began immediately, with Union soldiers trading their rifles for shovels as they began the methodical process of digging approach trenches toward the Confederate lines. It would be a different kind of warfare, characterized by engineering skill and patient endurance rather than dramatic charges and heroic sacrifices. By the first week of June 1863, the character of the Vicksburg campaign had changed completely. The rolling Mississippi countryside around the Confederate stronghold now resembled a vast construction site, with thousands of Union soldiers working around the clock to dig the network of trenches, parallels, and saps that would slowly strangle the city into submission. Harrison had traded his sword for an engineer's tools, spending his days supervising the construction of zigzag approach trenches that crept steadily closer to the Confederate lines. The work was dangerous and exhausting, conducted largely at night to avoid the constant threat of Confederate sharpshooters, who watched every movement from their elevated positions. The sound of picks and shovels had replaced the crash of artillery as the dominant noise of the campaign. The Union siege lines eventually stretched for 15 miles around Vicksburg, creating a continuous wall of earth and timber that sealed the city off from the outside world. Grant had positioned his army with scientific precision, using the natural terrain to maximize his advantages while minimizing his vulnerabilities. The Mississippi River provided an unbreachable barrier to the west, while Union gunboats patrolled the waterway to prevent any Confederate attempts at resupply or evacuation. General Pemberton understood the mathematics of siege warfare all too well. His 29,000 defenders were now consuming their stored supplies at an alarming rate, while Union forces continued to grow stronger with each passing day. Fresh regiments arrived regularly from across the North, bringing new weapons, ammunition, and supplies that seemed limitless compared to the Confederacy's dwindling resources. The civilians trapped inside Vicksburg began to experience the full horror of modern siege warfare. Families who had initially viewed the Union investment as a temporary inconvenience now found themselves living in caves carved into the city's hillsides, seeking shelter from the constant bombardment that Grant maintained to wear down Confederate morale. Children grew thin as food supplies dwindled, and the sound of crying babies became a constant backdrop to the thunder of artillery. Mrs. Emma Balfour, a Vicksburg resident whose diary would later provide historians with invaluable insights into civilian life during the siege, wrote of the gradual transformation of her once prosperous city. The streets that once bustled with commerce now lie empty except for soldiers and the occasional civilians scurrying between the safety of caves. Our beautiful homes stand empty, their windows boarded up against the shells that fall day and night without warning. The Union engineering effort was led by Captain Andrew Hickenlooper of the 5th Ohio Battery, whose innovative approach to siege warfare combined traditional military engineering with industrial-age efficiency. His men constructed approach trenches using techniques borrowed from railroad construction, complete with wooden revetments and drainage systems that allowed work to continue. Even during Mississippi's frequent thunderstorms, Confederate counter-engineering efforts were led by Colonel Samuel Henry Lockett, Pemberton's chief engineer, who had graduated from West Point just 7 years before the war began. Lockett's defensive innovations included the construction of counter mines, designed to destroy Union approach trenches before they could reach the main Confederate line. The underground war that developed beneath Vicksburg became almost as important as the fighting above ground. The most ambitious Union engineering project was the construction of a mine shaft beneath the 3rd Louisiana Redan, designed to place a massive explosive charge directly under the Confederate fortification. Michigan miners, recruited specifically for their expertise in underground work, labored for weeks to dig a tunnel through the red Mississippi clay. The project required precise calculation of angles and distances, as well as constant vigilance against Confederate counter-mining efforts. Life in the Union trenches developed its own rhythm and culture. Soldiers created elaborate dugouts complete with furniture made from ammunition boxes and newspapers from home that provided precious links to the world beyond the siege lines. Card games and letter writing occupied the long hours between work details, while informal truces sometimes developed that allowed both sides to retrieve water from nearby springs. The psychological pressure of siege warfare affected both armies differently. Union soldiers, confident in their eventual victory and well supplied with food and ammunition, maintained relatively high morale despite the constant danger from Confederate sharpshooters. Confederate defenders, facing dwindling supplies and no hope of relief, began to show signs of strain as the siege entered its second month. By mid-June, the Union siege lines had advanced to within a few hundred yards of the main Confederate works, in several places, close enough for soldiers on both sides to call insults and occasional friendly greetings. Across the narrow no-man's land that separated them, the morning of June 25, 1863, brought an ominous new dimension to the siege of Vicksburg as Union miners completed their tunnel beneath the 3rd Louisiana Redan. Captain Andrew Hickenlooper had spent 3 weeks supervising the dangerous work, as his Michigan miners burrowed through 45 feet of Mississippi clay to position 2,200 pounds of black powder directly under the Confederate fortification. Harrison stood in the Union frontline trench, watching through a periscope as Confederate soldiers went about their morning routines, unaware that tons of explosives lay just beneath their feet. The mine represented the culmination of scientific siege warfare, a precise application of engineering skill designed to breach defenses that had proven impregnable to direct assault. The countdown to detonation had begun, and every Union soldier within sight of the Louisiana Redan waited with nervous anticipation inside the Confederate works. Colonel Thomas Wall's Texas Legion maintained their vigilant watch, despite growing concerns about Union mining activities. Confederate engineers had detected sounds of digging weeks earlier and had begun their own counter-mining operations, but they had been unable to locate the exact position of the Union tunnel. The defenders could only wait and pray that their suspicions were unfounded. The explosion came at 3:30 in the afternoon, preceded by a rumbling sound that seemed to emerge from the very bowels of the earth. Harrison felt the ground shake beneath his feet, then watched in awe as the 3rd Louisiana Redan simply disappeared in a massive eruption of earth, timber, and human bodies. The blast created a crater 40 feet wide and 12 feet deep, completely obliterating the Confederate fortification and creating a gap in their defensive line. According to military historians cited in Bruce Catton's Grand Moves South, the Vicksburg mine explosion represented one of the earliest examples of industrial-scale military engineering in American warfare, demonstrating how technological innovation was transforming the nature of combat. The Union assault force, led by volunteers from the 45th Illinois Infantry, charged into the smoking crater within minutes of the explosion. However, the Confederate response proved faster and more effective than Grant's planners had anticipated. General Lewis Hebert's Louisiana Brigade quickly moved to contain the breach, establishing a new defensive line on the far side of the crater that prevented Union forces from exploiting their initial success. What followed was some of the most intense close-quarters fighting of the entire siege. Union soldiers found themselves trapped in the crater, unable to advance against the reformed Confederate line, but also unable to retreat across the open ground behind them. Hand-to-hand combat raged for hours as both sides fought desperately for control of the strategic position. Private Samuel Williams of the 45th Illinois later described the hellish conditions inside the crater. It was like fighting in a grave filled with the bodies of dead rebels, and chunks of earth mixed with pieces of timber from their fort. Every time we tried to climb out, their sharpshooters would pick us off. Every time they tried to drive us out, we'd make them pay dear for it. The fighting around the crater continued for days, with both sides constructing new earthworks within yards of each other. Confederate engineers, led by Colonel Lockett, managed to seal off the breach by extending their defensive line around the crater's rim. Union forces, despite their initial success in destroying the Louisiana Redan, found themselves no closer to capturing Vicksburg than they had been before the explosion. General Pemberton used the crater fighting as an opportunity to demonstrate Confederate resilience to his increasingly demoralized troops. He visited the front lines regularly, exposing himself to Union sniper fire to show his men that their commanders shared their dangers. His presence helped maintain morale among defenders, who were beginning to question whether continued resistance was worthwhile. The mine explosion also marked a turning point in civilian attitudes within Vicksburg. The massive blast had been felt throughout the city, shattering windows and collapsing cave shelters that had previously seemed safe from Union artillery. Families who had endured weeks of bombardment now faced the terrifying realization that the enemy could literally attack them from beneath the ground. Food shortages were becoming critical by late June, with Confederate soldiers reduced to quarter rations and civilians facing genuine starvation. The city's supply of flour, bacon, and coffee had been exhausted weeks earlier, replaced by cornmeal, mule meat, and various substitutes that provided little nutrition. Children were particularly affected, with many showing signs of malnutrition that would affect them for the remainder of their lives. Union forces, by contrast, were better supplied than they had been at any point during the campaign. Regular supply boats arrived from Memphis and St. Louis, bringing fresh food, ammunition, and medical supplies that kept Grant's army in fighting condition. The contrast in logistics capabilities between the two sides was becoming more apparent. With each passing day, the psychological impact of the mine explosion extended far beyond its immediate military consequences. Confederate soldiers now lived with the constant fear that the ground beneath their feet might explode without warning. While Union troops gained confidence from their demonstration of technological superiority, the balance of morale was shifting steadily in Grant's favor. By the first week of July, 1863, the situation inside Vicksburg had become desperate beyond all previous experience. Harrison could see the effects of prolonged siege through his field glasses as he observed Confederate positions from the Union front lines. Soldiers who had appeared well-fed and confident just 6 weeks earlier now moved with the sluggish gait of men suffering from chronic malnutrition, their uniforms hanging loose on gaunt frames. The civilian population faced even worse conditions than the military defenders. Mrs. Balfour's diary entries from this period described a city transformed into a nightmarish landscape of hunger and desperation. The children cry constantly from hunger, and their mothers have no food to give them. We have eaten our horses, our mules, and now some speak of catching rats to fill their empty bellies. The sound of artillery has become so constant that we barely notice it anymore. But the gnawing hunger never stops. General Pemberton faced an impossible situation. His 29,000 defenders were consuming the last of their stored supplies, while Union forces continued to tighten their grip around the city. Confederate soldiers had been reduced to eating leather, tree bark, and anything else that might provide minimal sustenance. Disease was beginning to spread through the crowded defensive works, with dysentery and typhoid claiming lives that enemy bullets had spared. The Confederate commander held increasingly frequent meetings with his senior officers, searching for any possible avenue of escape or relief. General Joseph Eggleston Johnston commanded the Confederate Army at Jackson, Mississippi, but his forces were too weak to break through Grant's lines and too far away to provide meaningful assistance. Pemberton's repeated requests for reinforcements had gone unanswered, leaving Vicksburg's defenders to face their fate alone. Union siege operations had reached a level of scientific precision that impressed military observers from around the world. British and French military attaches visited Grant's headquarters regularly, studying American innovations in siege warfare that would later influence European military doctrine. The network of approach trenches, parallels, and artillery positions represented the most sophisticated siege engineering effort In American military history, Captain Hickenlooper had begun work on a second mine, this one targeted at the 2nd Texas Lunette, another key Confederate fortification. The success of the first mine explosion, despite its limited tactical impact, had convinced Grant that underground warfare offered the best hope of breaking through Vicksburg's defenses without suffering prohibitive casualties in direct assault. The psychological pressure on Confederate defenders was becoming unbearable. Soldiers who had endured weeks of constant bombardment now faced the additional stress of knowing that Union miners might be digging beneath their positions at any moment. Sleep became almost impossible as men strained to detect the sounds of underground excavation that might herald their doom. Life in the Union trenches had settled into a routine of professional efficiency. Soldiers worked 8-hour shifts on siege construction, maintaining constant pressure on Confederate positions while minimizing their own casualties. The arrival of regular supply convoys from Memphis ensured that Grant's army remained well-fed and adequately equipped for extended operations. The naval component of the siege had proven equally effective. Admiral David Dixon Porter's squadron maintained complete control of the Mississippi River, preventing any Confederate attempts at resupply or communication with the outside world. Union gunboats fired regularly into the city, their shells adding to the constant bombardment that wore down civilian morale and destroyed infrastructure. International attention focused increasingly on Vicksburg as the siege entered its 7th week. European newspapers followed the campaign closely, recognizing that its outcome might determine the final result of the American Civil War. The London Times correspondent wrote that the fate of the American Republic may well be decided in the hills and valleys surrounding this Mississippi River town. General Grant maintained his headquarters in a comfortable house several miles behind the front lines, where he received a constant stream of reports from his subordinate commanders and consulted with his engineering officers about the progress of siege operations. His confidence in ultimate victory never wavered, even as the siege dragged on longer than his original estimates had projected. The contrast between conditions inside and outside Vicksburg became more stark with each passing day. Union soldiers enjoyed regular meals, adequate medical care, and the confidence that came from serving in a well-supplied army that was winning its campaign. Confederate defenders faced starvation, disease, and the growing certainty that their situation was hopeless. By July 3rd, even the most optimistic Confederate officers were beginning to acknowledge that surrender might be inevitable. The question was no longer whether Vicksburg would fall, but when and under what terms. Pemberton began preparing for the most difficult decision of his military career. The morning of July 3rd, 1863, dawned hot and humid over the besieged city of Vicksburg, but for the first time in 4 to 7 days, the usual thunder of artillery was replaced by an unusual quiet that seemed to hang over the battlefield like a shroud. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, standing in the Union frontline trenches, noticed the change immediately and wondered what it might portend. General Pemberton had spent the previous night in agonizing consultation with his senior officers, weighing options that ranged from a desperate breakout attempt to unconditional surrender. The mathematics of siege warfare had finally reached their inevitable conclusion. His starving army could not continue resistance much longer, and civilian suffering had reached levels that no honorable commander could ignore. At 10 o'clock in the morning, a white flag appeared above the Confederate works opposite the 3rd Louisiana Redan, followed by the approach of a lone Confederate officer carrying a message for General Grant. Major General Julius Daniel led the party under a flag of truce, his once immaculate uniform now showing the wear and stain of weeks in the trenches. The sight of Confederate officers approaching under a white flag sent ripples of excitement through the Union lines. The message that Daniel carried was brief but momentous. General Pemberton requested a meeting to discuss terms for the surrender of Vicksburg and its garrison. Grant, who had been expecting this moment for days, agreed to meet his Confederate counterpart between the lines at 3 o'clock that afternoon. The war's longest siege was finally approaching its end. The meeting took place beneath a large oak tree that stood in no man's land between the opposing armies. Pemberton, accompanied by several staff officers, appeared wan and exhausted, but maintained his military bearing as he saluted Grant and began the most difficult conversation of his professional career. Grant, confident in his position but respectful of his defeated opponent, listened carefully to Pemberton's initial proposals. The Confederate commander's first offer proposed that his army be allowed to march out with their weapons and personal belongings essentially requesting the honors of war traditionally accorded to a brave but defeated enemy. Grant, however, was under direct orders from Washington to accept nothing less than unconditional surrender, the same terms he had imposed on Fort Donelson the previous year. According to historical accounts preserved in the official records of the War of the Rebellion, Grant's response was characteristically direct: "The useless effusion of blood you propose stopping by this course can be ended at any time you may choose by the unconditional surrender of the city and garrison." The negotiations continued for several hours, with both commanders seeking terms that would preserve their honor while ending the siege. Eventually, Grant agreed to parole Pemberton's entire army rather than transport 29,000 Confederate soldiers to northern prison camps. This decision, while controversial among some Union politicians, proved strategically sound by freeing Grant's forces for other operations, while ensuring that most Confederate soldiers would return to their homes rather than rejoin the rebellion. The formal surrender ceremony took place at 10 o'clock on the morning of July 4th, 1863. Exactly 87 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, Confederate soldiers marched out of their earthworks and stacked their weapons in neat piles, while Union bands played patriotic airs, and thousands of spectators watched the historic proceedings. Harrison stood with his regiment as the Confederate colors were lowered for the final time over Vicksburg. Many of the Union soldiers watched in respectful silence as their opponents completed the bitter ritual of surrender. Recognizing the courage that the defenders had shown throughout the long siege, there was little celebration among the common soldiers who understood the human cost that both sides had paid for this moment. The fall of Vicksburg had immediate strategic consequences that reverberated throughout the Confederacy. The Mississippi River was now completely under Union control, effectively splitting the Confederate States of America in two and preventing the trans-Mississippi departments from contributing significantly to the war effort. President Lincoln's vision of the river running unvexed to the sea had finally been realized. The human cost of the Vicksburg campaign had been enormous on both sides. Union casualties totaled approximately 10,000 men killed, wounded, and missing during the campaign, while Confederate losses were somewhat lower in absolute numbers but represented a higher percentage of available manpower. The civilian population of Vicksburg had suffered tremendously, with many families requiring months to recover from the effects of prolonged siege. General Grant's victory at Vicksburg, combined with General George Gordon Meade's simultaneous victory at Gettysburg, marked the turning point of the American Civil War. The Confederacy would continue to resist for nearly 2 more years, but it would never again possess the strategic initiative or the resources necessary to achieve ultimate victory. The legacy of Vicksburg extended far beyond its immediate military significance. The campaign demonstrated the effectiveness of systematic siege warfare against prepared positions, lessons that would influence military thinking well into the 20th century. More importantly, it proved that the industrial resources and organizational capabilities of the North could eventually overcome the tactical brilliance and individual courage that had characterized Confederate resistance during the war's early years. As the sun set over the Mississippi River on July 4th, 1863, a new chapter in American history had begun, written in the blood and sacrifice of soldiers from both North and South who had fought with equal courage for causes they believed to be just.